Hello, and thank you for taking the time to watch our on-demand webinar session, Navigating Communications Tax, Agility and Compliance in a Fast-Changing Industry. My name is Jessica Burns. This webinar is produced by Aberdeen and is brought to you by Avalara. This session is pre-recorded, so we encourage you to reach out if you have any questions. Contact information will be provided at the conclusion of the webinar. Joining us today is Mike Locke, Senior Vice President and Principal Analyst at Aberdeen. Mike is responsible for managing the strategic direction of Aberdeen's research coverage in both traditional and more cutting-edge digital transformation topic areas. We're also joined by Steve Lacoff, General Manager of Avalara's Communications Business Unit. Steve has spent 20-plus years in the telecom and SaaS industry with experience in data, voice over IP, and video streaming. And now, to get things underway, I'll hand it over to Steve to tell us a bit more about Avalara.
Yeah, thanks for having me. We're excited to be here and excited for this webinar. I just wanted to do a brief introduction to Avalara to those of you who may not be familiar with our company and solutions. So Avalara is a technology and SaaS provider that helps companies of really all sizes automate the major steps of tax compliance. And that includes everything from registrations to tax calculations to returns filings, as well as exemption management. Avalara was founded in 2004, and we operate a multi-tenant SaaS platform. Since then, we've grown to the point where we power the tax and compliance ranging from the very small emerging businesses to the largest global Fortune 500. And we support companies that literally cut across all industries, including communications and media, which is a big strategic focus for us and an area of significant investment and growth. And an important part of what we do is to provide pre-built integrations or connectors into a wide range of systems that manage your transactions. And this can be ERP systems, billing management platforms, payment gateways, subscription management platforms. And so, ease of integration is a big part of what we deliver. And over the years, we've invested heavily in our technology platforms and partner integrations, and we've achieved massive scale. And so, over the last year, we've supported over 17.6 billion API calls, and we filed over 2 million returns annually. So again, just a quick introduction to Avalara and our Avalara for Communications business unit. Excited to be here, and with that, I'm going to hand it off to Mike, who can talk through the agenda.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Steve, and welcome to everyone joining us today. When I get the chance to speak with folks in the user community, it's always really exciting for me because of the role that you guys play in our research. Some of you might already be familiar with Aberdeen. You might know that all of our research is fact-based in nature, and it's driven by end-user feedback, mainly to our survey interviews and other conversations that we have. So the research is based on user feedback, and the research output is really geared toward end-user education. So what I'll be talking about today is some of the recent findings that we've captured, mainly from a dedicated survey that explored communications tax compliance. In terms of an agenda for today, we've broken this up into 3 main sections here. After each one of these sections, by the way, what I'd like to do is throw things over to Steve from the Avalara team to give his perspective on some of the findings that I put together from each of these sections. So first, I want to set the stage with some background findings that we've gathered and talk through some of the challenges that companies are facing right now in this current environment. Then I'll jump into the heart of the research findings and really start to get into the minds of these companies we surveyed. What are their concerns? How are they addressing them, both from a process standpoint as well as sort of from a technology standpoint? And then the third section here gets into our discussion of the best in class. The companies that we've set aside, the ones that we've isolated that are performing at the highest level. What does that performance look like? And what are some of the common characteristics that those best-in-class companies share? So to kick things off here, I did want to bring out some very, very recent findings relative to this current environment that we're in. So we launched a what we call a cross-practice survey, trying to understand how companies are coping with the pandemic environment. Almost 2,000 companies in total. A couple of key takeaways here from this slide. One, when you look at the business landscape in general, companies out there are struggling, as you might imagine, and that goes for pretty much all industries, but certainly very much so in the communications world. But there is a fairly substantial portion of these companies that report seeing growth despite everything else that's going on. So we asked this question essentially, what has been the immediate impact of the pandemic to your business? So the majority of companies have seen a loss in business, but many of them are actually seeing revenue growth. The interesting thing, though, and we pull this out into the two pie charts on the right, is that companies are still investing. Looking at the telecom space in particular, 68% of companies are continuing or even in some cases increasing their spend on upgrading existing technology, and more than 60% are continuing or increasing their spend on net new technology, as well as upgrade to existing technology. So more of these companies are growing than one might think. More of them are maintaining or even in some cases increasing their technology spend than you might think, despite the environment. So now to jump into the findings from the dedicated survey that I talked about before that looked at communications tax. One of the first questions that we asked is around some of the challenges. So I should mention here, all of the companies that we surveyed here, all of them self-reported having communications tax responsibilities as part of their job role. So we're looking at very relevant companies and people here. We provided a list of several challenges, asking them to rank them on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the most difficult. So this chart here shows all the 4s and 5s as a percentage of respondents. Regulatory change, the struggle to stay up to date with it, really tops the list here. But there are several others that really keep companies up at night. Things like constantly updating their pricing models and calculating taxes across multiple jurisdictions. Of course, integrating multiple ERP systems. This is something that we see a lot throughout much of our research, is the disparity and sort of the heterogeneity of the different business systems that companies have in place. According to the research, also, this is an industry that thrives on rapidly changing products, new bundles, dynamic pricing, all things that can present real challenges when it comes to tax compliance. And then from sort of a similar perspective, we asked, with respect to a variety of rapidly changing dynamics, which of them are expected to have the biggest impact on tax compliance efforts over the next 2 years? So the last slide was the current environment. Here we're looking into the near future. Once again, looking at the 4s and 5s combined. These were the ones that really stood out, almost identical in their sort of relative intensity level here. And again, though, the variability of regulations across jurisdictions is a major challenge. But also the software environment specifically. Companies believe that automation and addressing compliance within their technology infrastructure is really going to have a major impact on their tax compliance efforts, and the related overhead as a result, or lack thereof, hopefully. Also, though, companies do foresee potential concerns related to changing tax burden as they launch new and different products and different bundles. One other data point here that I thought was interesting, I wanted to put in here before I throw things over to Steve, is this one here. We asked respondents directly, do you believe that you'll be required to collect or file communications taxes in the next 2 years? Less than half of them said definitely yes. So that means almost 60% of them, some of them said probably yes, but almost 60% of them, more than half, really weren't entirely sure whether or not they're going to be subject to or mandated to collect communications tax in the next 2 years. So interesting little tidbit there. I think actually here's a good time to transition over to Steve and get his perspective on this. Steve, I'm curious from the Avalara perspective in your world, What have you guys seen from your customers over the past few months with the COVID environment? How are companies really doing?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So the data you've presented is really interesting in that it really does align really closely with what we've seen at Avalara and specifically within our Avalara for Communications business unit. With the onset of the COVID pandemic, frankly, we didn't know what to expect. We anticipated that communications and media would hold up better than other parts of the economy. But at the outset, we anticipated that it would be more concentrated in communication segments like conferencing and streaming. But the reality is that we've seen really broad-based strength across our business. And I think this is reflected with the fact that with the pandemic, companies are obviously embracing remote work. And so that requires a deployment of a work from home technology stack. And so this incorporates a lot of services, right? You need reliable data connectivity, you need enterprise VoIP, you need secure VPN capabilities, as well as video conferencing and unified collaboration platforms. And so with people working from home, there's been a massive need for those capabilities, as well as on the consumer side, there's just been tremendous growth and adoption in streaming. And so what this has really resulted in is us seeing broad-based strength across our business, just being consolidated within the conferencing and streaming segments. And so that's been a very pleasant surprise to see how, resilient a lot of our customers' businesses have been. One common theme that I think is reflected in a lot of the other data points that you brought out in terms of some of the key challenges and goals for customers is that a lot of comms companies are looking at this as an opportunity to invest, right? As a way to insulate themselves from any potential downturns. And so they're really focused on ROI. And so a big part of what we do as an automated SaaS platform is we take these highly manual, complex processes and we introduce automation, efficiency, and drive really durable long-term cost savings for our customers. And so the pace of replatforming their ERP and billing management systems has, also created an opportunity for customers to invest their tax and compliance. So we really haven't seen the pace of business slow down. And I think, that aligns with and is reflected in some of the results of your research.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Steve. It's encouraging for me. Obviously you look at the world right now in the particular market that we're talking about today. It certainly tracks in my head that a lot of these companies are performing well, given the need for all of these, work from home type services and technology stacks that you're talking about. So it's great to see that they're performing well, and it tracks with some of the research findings that we had. Certainly, as we think about all the companies and all the different services they're providing and which ones are helping these companies perform, there are certainly things, though, that stand in the way of them sort of growing and surviving. So the next section here starts to get into that conversation of what are the things that sort of hinder these companies. So first, let's look at non-compliance here and talk about some of the concerns surrounding this. Because this is definitely top of mind for a lot of companies. So we asked this question directly to the survey takers. What are the main things that concern you when it comes to non-compliance? Right. So the first one on the left here is pretty obvious, right? Companies are worried about fines and penalties from failing to comply. But I think the second one over is a little bit more interesting. So the notion of innovating, but without thinking through the tax implications of what these new offerings might bring, sort of an unwanted consequence, if you will. Companies don't want to inhibit time to market. They don't want to fall behind the competition because of tax issues. They don't want damage to their reputation. Basically, they want to grow and succeed and not let tax compliance sort of stand in the way of that. And speaking of tax getting in the way, we also asked a question around audits, more specifically around failing an audit. So not only have the majority of companies been through an audit, but according to the research, actually more than half of these companies said that they've failed an audit. So a lot of them been through an audit. Many of them have failed an audit. So why is that? Why is it that they fail an audit? Here are a few of the reasons here, as we captured in the survey. As they rapidly bring new products to market, sometimes they don't realize that a new offering is subject to communications tax. They don't understand the statutes. Sometimes they don't feel that they're clear. Sometimes they fail to document aspects of their business relevant to tax compliance, and that opens them up to problems. Or they simply miscalculate the tax rate, or they file the taxes incorrectly. A lot of different reasons that it can happen. So you can see how many of these can come into play with this environment of rapidly changing regulation, rapid new product launch, changing tax codes. It really can become quite the challenge for these companies. So shifting gears now, actually, to something perhaps a little bit more positive. As we talked about before, there are plenty of companies growing and thriving in this environment, and this is what Steve was talking about before. So let's talk about where they're seeing that opportunity for growth. Whether it's new customers or new products, we ask the question, how important are the following things to your business? So really strong demand for video and digital content, rich media, that sort of thing. The introduction of 5G network technology, as well as the absurdly growing or absurdly fast-growing IoT market, billions of connected devices. And finally, what the research shows as a market decrease in traditional voice services. So some of the key market drivers here that ultimately relate back to a company's technology strategy. So as they try to address those market drivers that we just showed, what are the tools, both from a platform perspective, but also from sort of a feature perspective, that they really rely on to help bolster their tax compliance capabilities? So certainly companies rely on ERP as a system of record to track the information they need regarding compliance, but the bulk of companies have also invested in a comprehensive software solution for tax compliance. Under that umbrella, some of the features that they include within their solution set, things like automated tax rate calculation, automated filing, certificate management, and taxability evaluation tools. In addition to the specific technologies employ, many of them are also looking to adapt their infrastructure as well. So the research shows that upwards of 40% of companies, in some cases, have moved to a cloud or a SaaS-based environment for some key components of their stack, things like filing, billing, and tax calculation. So as we think about SaaS, some interesting findings here. I wanted to add this slide in to show one in particular. So we asked survey respondents what they perceive as the top benefits of SaaS-based technology. A lot of you are probably of a similar mindset than me. You remember when security was actually the top concern or the hindrance to migrating to the cloud and SaaS-based products. Now, pick your reason, because of the number of companies migrating to the cloud, the amount of data stored in these applications, the pace of innovation in cloud technology, security is now viewed as the number one benefit of SaaS, which I thought was really interesting. So things like accuracy, reliability, scalability, they certainly factor in. But definitely thought it was interesting to see security listed here as a key benefit of a SaaS-based environment. So, Steve, I brought up a number of different things here from in the last few finding slides, from tax concerns, audits, technology, and then SaaS. How do those findings line up with what you've seen from Avalara customers?
Yeah, I mean, again, the data is just really interesting, and there are a lot of consistencies with what we've seen. I'll tell you one thing that I did find a little bit surprising is and notable was the percentage of companies that had undergone an audit, right? I mean, I think that basically came out to north of 20%. of customers that had recently undergone an audit. That's something that we track with our customers, and I can tell you that our customers, seem to be far less exposed. And I think, that's just to a large degree, a result of investing in automation and really a key benefit of the services that we provide. And then when with the market drivers that you outlined, the growth in streaming and IoT and the pivot away from traditional voice services is strongly in line with what we've seen. I mean, all three of those verticals are big areas of growth for us, and particularly in streaming. We're seeing a lot of need and demand due to the fact that there are just a lot of new emerging and complex tax regimes that are being imposed on streaming services, and also just increased vigor from the jurisdictions in imposing these taxes and actually collecting those. And then also from an IoT perspective, increasingly you've got IoT companies that are bundling physical devices with network capabilities or data plans. And so that's driving a big need to support communication taxes. And then, the one thing that was really interesting to me was when you talked about how customers are implementing technology. I thought it was great to see that balanced mix of how customers and companies are implementing platforms. So, there are customers who are looking for a complete compliance solution that comprises both tax calculation and returns. And then you've got a big segment of customers that are leaning towards a standalone engine or a standalone compliance solution. And so one of the things that makes our solutions unique at Avalara for communications is that we provide a really complete solution, but we do it in a modular fashion. So, what I'm saying is customers can utilize our engine, they can utilize our return standalone, or they can buy a fully integrated solution. And so we continue to see a solid mix of engine-only customers as well as end-to-end customers. But I'd say there has definitely been a lean towards customers looking for more of a complete end-to-end solution that encompasses not only tax calculations, but also supporting compliance and returns capabilities. And then lastly, I would agree with what you said about SaaS. I just thought it was fascinating that the top benefit was recognized as security. And I think this speaks to SaaS becoming more widely adopted. It's essentially the de facto type of solution now. And so I think just in general, companies are better informed on the benefits of SaaS solutions. I've spent the better part of a decade in the industry, and it was really just a couple of years ago where companies had this knee-jerk concern about the security of SaaS solutions, despite the fact that they're, profoundly more secure than a premise-based solution. And so over the past few years, we've encountered, less and less resistance, less questioning. But I would say it was slightly surprising to see that at the top of the list as the top benefit. But it was also satisfying and gratifying to see the extent to which this is understood with customers.
Yeah, agreed. It was a little bit surprising to me as well, but it certainly makes sense in light of a lot of what you just talked about. You talked a lot about sort of the breadth of the stack and the balanced nature of a lot of that technology. Definitely something that you said you've seen from your customers. It's also something that we see from best-in-class companies, and that's not just from this particular survey, but in other areas as well. They have a breadth and a sort of a comprehensive stack that allows them to accomplish multiple things in sort of a flexible environment like that. So certainly agree on that front. It sort of brings us to a pretty good segue to talk about best-in-class companies, both with the notion of them being tech savvy, but also building some agility into their processes. So let's talk about that for a second here. So As a reminder for Aberdeen's research, the way that we conduct our research, it's all fact-based and it's end user driven, as we talked about. The way that we talk about performance is in three categories: best in class, average, and laggard. When we launch a survey, we ask a variety of different metrics questions, and the companies that score in the top 20% are what we call the best in class. And what this slide here is showing is the three metrics that we chose for best in class and how they've performed against those. So this is when we talk about best in class, this is actually what we're talking about. This is specifically what we mean. We looked at three metrics: improvement in total cost of audits, improvement in time dedicated to all tax filing, and then preparedness for communications tax obligations. So again, scoring each respondent based on how they answered these questions. Best in class, as I mentioned, are the ones that scored in the top 20% by aggregate performance. And you see some of the discrepancies here between the top companies and everyone else. Almost 8 times the improvement in audit cost on average, 5 times the reduction in time dedicated to tax filing, 4 times more likely to report a high level of preparedness for tax compliance. It's an important one there. So just giving you a picture of what the best-in-class companies look like in terms of performance. But we also want to understand what are some of the things that really define best-in-class behavior? What separates them from the pack, so to speak? One of the interesting things that we'll build on is this simple point here. Tax compliance can be a moving target. Companies really need to understand, they need to be consistently thinking about how they adapt and plan for future changes in the tax code and how they're going to strengthen their compliance. More than 2/3 of best-in-class companies plan on changing their tax management processes over the next 2 years, compared with less than half of average companies and less than 1/3 of laggards. So relatively simple point here, but one that probably bears returning to. In the last section, we looked at a slide that showed a range of technologies that companies put in place. We talked about that balanced stack that Steve mentioned. Here's some of that same data here, but now we've sliced it to look at best-in-class, average, and laggard companies. So they're much more likely to have that comprehensive, complete tax platform in place. They're able to tie these processes in very well with their ERP platform, and they also leverage automated tax returns and filing at a rate that far outpaces their peers. So more adaptability and automation in their technology environment for the best-in-class companies. And then we talked about SaaS just a few slides ago and some of the key benefits there. The research also shows how best-in-class companies are more likely to run things like tax calculation and automated tax returns in a SaaS environment. Perhaps it's for scalability reasons, perhaps it's for ease of deployment. It might even be for those perceived security benefits that we talked about before. But the best-in-class companies are more likely to operate some of their key activities in a SaaS environment compared with other companies. So I wanted to bring it back now to this concept of adaptability and preparedness, those two concepts. So we talked before about this being a big issue, preparedness. Companies were asked to rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 5 in terms of their preparedness for tax issues related to changes in their product mix. Almost 3/4 of best-in-class companies rated themselves as a 4 or 5 on that scale, compared with less than half of laggards. We also asked companies then to rate how dynamic their business model is on a scale of 1 to 10 this time. So how fast are regulations changing? How rapidly are they introducing new products or new bundles? 93% of best-in-class companies rate themselves at an 8 or higher on that scale of how dynamic their business model is. So it's interesting when you juxtapose those two things, worth reiterating. Not only are best-in-class companies performing well, but they're also doing so in an environment that is changing very rapidly. and they rate themselves as highly prepared for changes in the tax environment. So in a way, they're agile because they have to be, and then they reap the benefit of that agility as a result. So before I wrap up my section of the slides here and hand things back to Steve, I'll just draw out a few of the key takeaways from the research. As companies in this communications world continue to introduce new products and make themselves subject to changes in the tax environment, so many of them are now turning to solutions that help automate that process, save them time, and reduce friction on time to market. Secondly, some of the key tools that help in this journey, they have a few things in common, but the main one is probably flexibility, sort of the flexibility to operate in a complex and disparate technology stack, the flexibility to onboard new users quickly and securely in a SaaS environment, and the flexibility to handle the rapidly changing dynamics of their tax liabilities. And then finally, when we look at best-in-class companies, one of the key characteristics that really bubbles to the surface is their propensity to continuously innovate, both in their product set, but also in the way that they optimize processes and technology to manage taxes for their growing businesses. So one last time here, I wanted to throw back to Steve. Steve, the research points to a few things that really fuel top companies. I just talked about flexibility. That sort of goes hand in hand with agility. And when we talk about agility, it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So can you talk a little bit about agility and what that means for Avalara customers and some of the capabilities that help support that agility?
Sure. Yeah. When we look at the characteristics of best-in-class providers, the point that really drew my interest was, the fact that 93% of the best-in-class providers had more dynamic business models. I think one of the key drivers here is just the pace of change in the industry. And so when we look at our customers and prospects, we see a number of prevailing themes playing out. The first is convergence. And so, convergence, there's probably not a more overused phrase in our industry. And traditionally convergence, kind of convergence version 1.0, implied convergence at the network layer, data, voice, video, all running on a single infrastructure. Well, what's happening now is things are converging at the application layer. And so this means a single application where video conferencing, voice, instant messaging, document sharing, it's all unified in a single interface, and it just works. And so increasingly to compete, companies have to expand and build out a broader set of bundled services. The second piece is expanded channels, right? So companies are not only selling direct to consumer, but they're also leveraging reseller networks. But what's also becoming more prevalent is selling through digital marketplaces. The third I would say is geographic scope, right? Because a lot of communication services today are cloud-based and really have no or limited reliance on physical infrastructure. They can more easily be offered in different geographic theaters. And so it's very easy to expand globally. And then the last piece is M&A, right? M&A and consolidation and building up scale is just kind of a constant in our industry. And so if you take all these things, expanding product mixes, bundling, a broader network of sales channels, selling globally, all this requires agility, not only in underlying provisioning ERP, but also billing management and tax systems. And so, companies need to be able to quickly evolve and tune their processes and systems to support a much wider range of services, more go-to-market paths and geographies. And so, SaaS capabilities and platforms inherently provide this agility. But, I'd say also the key piece here is having out-of-the-box integration into these underlying ERP and billing management platforms is crucial. And that's a big part of what we do and what we invest in. And so, I would say, kind of broadly speaking, that's how I would characterize, how we think about this and how it's reflected in the companies that we talk to and work with.
Awesome. That's great. Thanks, Steve. Um, you brought up a number of different really sort of important concepts there, that a few of them are worth returning to here as we close out. We wanted to end here with a couple of polling questions. So for anyone watching this, I'd love for you to sort of think these through and come up with an answer in your mind before we show the results of what the market thinks here. But there were a couple of these relate to what you were just talking about, Steve. So there's been a lot of discussion around product mix, dynamic product mixes, bundling, coming up with new and innovative ways to combine solutions to meet the demands of where the market is right now. And that's actually sort of the theme of the first polling question here. So this was something that we asked as well, and would be curious for anyone watching. When you think about the changes in your product mix, what are the things that are really driving those changes? Are they driven by product innovations? Is it new products and the need for new innovations? Is it competitive pressure, pricing and profitability issues, M&A activity, or just sort of general changes in the market? Steve, before I show some of the results here, what do you think is going to turn out as the biggest driver of changes in product mix?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. If I had to pick, I would say, I'm kind of juggling here between new product and market changes. And what's driving me to that is, customers are increasingly looking for unified collaboration platforms, right? So if you think about a Zoom or a Microsoft Teams or even a Slack, right? They're looking to integrate multiple communication services into one platform, where things just seamlessly operate, right? And so I think it's increasingly difficult to kind of be a one-trick pony, where customers are asking their providers to provide a broader set of services. So if I had to guess, that's where I would anticipate we would end up, is in those two boxes.
All right. Well, let's see what we got here. So this is from the market, and you're pretty darn close here. We got pricing and profitability being number one, and this to me, and correct me if you disagree, but this probably ties in very closely with this concept of bundling, because as you think about profitability, particularly in the communications in the streaming world, the notion of bundling services is probably something that a lot of these folks are taking a hard look at when it comes to becoming more profitable. You talked about market change, you talked about new product introductions. But there's an interesting surge here when it comes to the pricing and profitability, as well as keeping up with the Joneses, so to speak, and the competitive drive to change the product mix. Any other thoughts on these?
No, I think it's interesting. I think there's a lot of interplay between these factors, and
Yep.
We're all margin driven, and so it's not surprising, I guess, that pricing and profitability kind of rose to the top there.
Great. So, second question here before we wrap up. This was another interesting one. So, back to the world of tax compliance. One of the questions that we always ask in our surveys is, we try to understand who are the best in class companies based on performance. Once we understand that, we also want to understand what are some of the things that correlate with that performance. What are the things that they rely on? And that's essentially what this question is asking. So when you think about some of these internal questions and their ability to support better tax compliance, what are the things that you most rely on? Is it an established and documented process for collecting and filing communications taxes? Is it sort of process based? Is it automation of calculating taxes? a streamlined way of calculating taxes based on dynamically changing tax rates? Do you rely most on automation when it comes to verifying tax accuracy? Perhaps it's a standardized workflow for sharing tax and accounting information, or perhaps it's more related to the flexibility of your business systems and the ability to sort of quickly tailor them to support tax changes. So we've got a few here, sort of process-based and automation, technology-based. Why don't I show the results here rather than Steve making you guess again? We can sort of we can mull these over. Some of the top capabilities here. So streamlining the calculations process from this particular survey turned out to be the most commonly cited capability that companies rely on when it comes to tax compliance. But also a standardized workflow for sharing tax and accounting information with auditors, so that again this whole notion of the audit process being a little bit more prevalent than maybe some of us might have thought. These are things that bubbled up to the surface here. Any closing thoughts on some of these capabilities, or even some others that you've seen from your customers that might really help support better compliance?
Yeah, this doesn't surprise me. All of these are certainly crucial, but I think the second one, where you start talking about tax calculations based on tax rates, doesn't surprise me that was the leader, because that's really the foundation, right? You've got to be able to tax increasingly on a real-time, timely basis, and it's got to be accurate, right? If you're not accurately calculating your taxes, then that's going to have a lot of downstream impacts on other processes and other compliance functions like returns. So that's neat to see.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Steve. I really appreciate the perspective here. I want to thank everyone else for joining. Anyone who's joining us today and listening to sort of the back and forth between the research findings and the Avalara perspective. Really appreciate that. I think at this point, what we'll do is go ahead and hand things back to Jess Burns. Jess?
Thanks, Mike. And with that, we'll conclude our webinar session for today. I want to take a moment to thank Mike and Steve for sharing their research, insights, and recommendations with us. And a special thanks to Avalara for making this webinar possible. We hope you found this webinar to be beneficial, and if you'd like to learn more, you can reach out via the contact information, or feel free to visit the links provided. Again, I want to thank you all for attending this webinar, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.